Today, I really am truly grateful that they're joined by Noemie Lopian and Derek Niemann. In a highly unusual, indeed possibly unique partnership, Dr. Noemie Lopian, daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, has teamed up with Derek Niemann, grandson SS officer. They are sharing their stories as a warning of the perils of extremism and to inspire greater understanding. I hope you'll all join me in giving a warm welcome to both Derek and Noemie for visiting the Cambridge Union. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by saying that Noemie and I intend to be as frank, as open and honest as possible. And I would value you being as blunt as you like. If you want to ask the question, how can Noemie possibly get together with the grandson of an SS officer, then do ask that question. I want to take you back initially to a school assembly. Noemie, this was on Friday, so Noemie had to get home for Shabbat, so I did it solo. This wasn't any ordinary school or any ordinary assembly. This was a Jewish school, and the speaker before me was a Holocaust survivor. And at the end of her talk, the girls were obviously distressed. She asked them if they had any questions. The first question came from a teenage girl who said, "What can we do to stop this happening again?" And the survivor came back with an answer that staggered me and still staggers me. She said, "Seek out people who are not like you, who come from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds. Get to know them, befriend them, understand their point of view." 2 years before that, I was speaking at a synagogue about my grandfather. And at the end, a woman who'd been sitting at the back came to the front and said, "I want us to speak together." A woman with courage, with vision, and with chutzpah, good Jewish word. And that woman was Noemie. Over to Noemie.
Thank you, Derek, for always this wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. It means so much to the both of us. As you might have detected by now a little bit, I have a little bit of a twang, so I'm told when I speak English. Well, I grew up in Munich, Bavaria, Germany, not knowing Munich's relevance or importance, if you will, during World War II. My mum is French, my dad was Polish, and all I wanted to do was always to just fit in. I came to England at the age of 13 and moved to Manchester, up north, where I've come from today. I didn't know about my parents' story being in the Holocaust. I had no idea. I grew up actually with a love of Munich, and I always say particularly around Christmas time. It was absolutely magical. Some of you will have been to the German Christmas markets that we've brought into Britain. And as a child, it was just gorgeous. It was winter wonderland. And even locally, wherever you lived, all the shops were transformed. So I had a very happy time. However, I grew up being told, and that was protective, and I don't take it badly for my mum. She was protecting us, and she said, never draw attention onto yourselves. Almost I should disappear. And be extra good and extra kind and extra clean, above all extra clean. Nobody should call you the dirty Jew. I went to a Jewish primary school, but subsequently I went to a non-Jewish high school. We were 1,800 girls, and the high school was actually called Sophie Scholl Gymnasium. Sophie Scholl is, some of you might have heard, is our white rose. She was a young woman who belonged to a resistant movement. So when people sometimes say, and you'll hear that throughout our talk, that people didn't know what was happening, which many said post-war and might still say today, well, they did. How come a young 22-year-old woman knew? So I only found out by now, it's probably 11, 12 years ago, that my mother has a story I never knew, nor did my father know. My father died without ever knowing, and I think that's so sad. And the reason is that my mum felt that her experience during the Holocaust was lesser than my father's. And I always say human suffering is incomparable. My dad, after the war, after having been through 7 labor and concentration camps over 4.5 years, from the age of 19 on the 25th of March 1941, early hours of a Tuesday morning, when he was taken away from his parental home by the Germans. At 4 a.m. he heard commotion downstairs, and they didn't stay long downstairs. They came in with their dogs and batons and beat him out of the flat. He was liberated close to Munich by the Americans on the 30th of April 1945. He stayed there. He was hospitalized for 8 months, went to a DP camp, that's a displaced persons camp, where many people who had been in the concentration camps went to, really because they had nothing. They had no relatives, no, no money to live, to survive, no flat, no qualification, nothing. Because the formative years of their lives, they were in these camps. So they sort of went to rehabilitate, if you will, but without any, not like we have today, without any psychology or particularly love or caring or any of that sort of thing. They didn't know about post-traumatic stress disorder, or did anybody know how people would feel after this experience. And that was one of the reasons why my dad wrote the book, The Long Night. And that was in order, my dad, after the war, subsequently, I should say, studied medicine and dentistry. So he wanted the medical profession and the scientists to know what had happened to these people and how to treat them post-war if ever they came across them. So I said to you, he was in 7 labor and concentration camps. He was 17 in 1939 when war broke out, and he lived in a small Polish town in Upper Silesia called Zawiercie. And initially, how did he find out about the war? Things were changing, was that the aeroplanes were flying over his town. And he thought, oh, it's quite exciting. But that very quickly changed, that feeling of excitement, probably within hours when he realized how much the climate for him had changed. His family tried to go to the neighboring town, to his grandparents' house, trying still to think this was September 1939 of ways to escape, but it was too late. Initially, on that fateful Tuesday morning, on the 25th of March, 1941, he was taken away to Grünheide together with his father. And my grandfather became weaker and sicker, and my dad actually managed to get my grandfather back home, although home was no longer how my dad would have known or any of us would call home. By then it had become a ghetto, and more than 2 families lived in the flat. There was no food. The Jews weren't allowed to go to work. No social activity. So life outside the camps wasn't life to what you and I know. It was full of restrictions and full of danger as well, because any time one could get picked up and taken into a camp. My grandfather and my grandmother, my dad was the eldest of 4. 1 sister survived, but the sister whose name I carry and his younger brother, they were gassed and burnt in Auschwitz in 1943. His surviving sister was in Auschwitz as well. My dad, post-war, treated the Germans. They were his patients. And one in particular, he took under his wing. And I always say it's probably not strictly kosher, because it was his patient, and she became my adopted grandma. She was in her 60s, she was widowed, she had no children and no family. The interesting thing is, when I asked my mum what her husband was up to in the war, or indeed she or her relatives, my mum is vague. This lady taught me about life, and as did my dad, by accepting her as a family member, and her in turn treating us as her family member. We learned about humanity, not through talks, but by example. I can't tell you how my father felt immediately after what he'd been through. I'm sure it was a psychological process that he had to go through himself. My mum was a little girl of 10. She lived by then in Saint-Junien, the southwest of France. She was 5 when war broke out, and she lived in Strasbourg, which is the French-German border to this day, to Kehl am Rhein is Germany. And Jewish people and non-Jewish people had to be evacuated. And Saint-Junien initially was a very happy place for my mum, even though there things weren't quite like normal either. She didn't go to a normal school anymore. Her school was only for children of the Jewish faith, and all the ages were tumbled together. But as time passed, my families would disappear, children were picked up from the streets, and my grandparents were frequently urged to send my mum, who was by then 10, her older sister Helen 13, and her younger brother Joey 9, away to Switzerland to safety. You can understand that my mum, little René's parents, were reluctant to send their 3 children away across France with a group leader that they didn't know, an organization that was the underground. It wasn't safe when they felt the German presence daily. But they did. My grandparents decided, and René went with an unknown stranger. The 3 of them went, and they traveled through France, and in each place, more children joined the group. They went first to a convent, and then they hid in Lyon at the station, Gare du Perrache, which was being bombed at the time, and they had to hide underneath. And then again, more children joined. Each time they changed venue, a new group leader came. And from Lyon, they traveled to Annecy. There they were told to keep low profile, not to make themselves be known, and if there's anybody in uniform, just to be very polite and say nothing. René had to be frightened of people in uniform. People who you and I, civilians of any faith, of any race, quite rightly, we look at people in uniform as our protectors, police, the army. In René's case, it was the inverse. So little René actually hid on the train in the toilet from Lyon to Annecy. In Annecy, she was met by Marianne Kohn, a young 22-year-old woman who altogether saved my mum and her group of children, plus another 170 children, by smuggling them from France across the border into Switzerland. Marianne was very warm. She had something magical. My mum felt really safe. And in Annecy, she took them to the lake. It was a sunny day, June 1944. And she showed them Switzerland. And the kids felt it. They breathed it. They thought they were so near safety. There was an excitement. Marianne said, "Children, we've missed the train, but I managed to get us a driver and a lorry." And they went into one of these lorries that you might have seen in the pictures with green sort of canvas, this thick canvas. And on they went, and they were told to be quiet and not to lift up the flap, even though it was sweltering hot. Group of boys and girls, 32. And not far into the journey, the van screeched to a halt. One of the boys peeped out, even though he shouldn't, and he quickly whispered that the Germans in the front in a Citroën. And then immediately behind, a much larger van of Germans also pulled up. The Germans from the front got out, bellowed, "Who's the responsible?" Marianne jumped out, said it's her, with machine guns and sniffer dogs from behind. And she said, "These are children that belong to the railway workers." She said a white lie. And the Lyon's being bombed, so I'm taking the children away from the bombings. And they said, "Well, show us where you're taking the children." So she took them to this home that she should have done. And the lady stood there waiting on the steps with her arms folded and said, "These aren't the children we're expecting. I'm only expecting a group of boys." The older children were immediately taken to Prison du Pax in Annemasse, and René stayed a few hours in this home and then was taken the following morning. In prison, René, Helen, and Joey were interrogated daily at gunpoint by a Gestapo officer, with another Gestapo officer sitting behind his desk, taking notes in a very small cell. I went to visit the prison with the BBC a few years ago and saw what it was like. Helen, to this day, says the minute the interrogation was over, she feared the next day of the repeated interrogations. They never knew what time of day they would come. He asked René with a gun point to her head, "Are you Jewish? What's your name? Where are you from? What's your parents' name? Where do your parents live?" And they kept repeating that on a spool. And what they wanted was to have the parents' addresses, because they wanted to send the parents away, either be shot or to camps. Days passed, and Marianne went out to work, and one night she came back into the prison, and René could barely recognize her. Her head was swollen, and René always does that, double the size, being tortured and beaten. Marianne, in July, was taken away from prison. She wanted, as she was leaving prison, wanted to get her toiletries ready, and the guard said, "You won't be needing any of that." She was taken away not too far away. She was raped and tortured and shot. René was then saved by the Lord Mayor of Annemasse, Jean Defoe. He made a double deal with the Gestapo, saying, by then it was July 44, the Germans knew they were losing the war, and they wanted to get back to Germany, but the railway lines were bombed. It wasn't easy for them to get back. So the Lord Mayor said, "I'll help you to get back if you give me the children." Because they couldn't get the children into camps. They were going to shoot these children, because what to do with them? So the Lord Mayor pretended to be on the side of the Gestapo, but he had to sign a form saying that any time the Gestapo made him sign the form that the Gestapo want to come back, he'll take the children, he'll have to return the children. But that didn't happen, and the Lord Mayor managed to take René and the group of her siblings and the group of 32 children across to Switzerland. Why do I think this story is relevant today, or both my parents' story? Because human nature doesn't change. We live in an age with TikTok and Insta and Snapchat, and for us golden oldies, Facebook. But humanity doesn't change. Our characteristics, our nature does not change. Like then, today too, we're all capable of good and evil. And we're all inherently prejudiced. Let's be honest, we all don't like the other. And you know who knows that better than any of us? Our social media platforms. What do they give us when we like more of the same and more of the same? They give us the same thoughts. We don't think different. And yet how much we grow when we do have different. And you and I know that, because when people are involved in projects, you get people with different skills and different this. When buildings are built, you need different, not same and same. I don't know how long I've spoken for now. Is that time? Okay, so if maybe in the questions and answer I will read to you a passage from my dad's book, which I like to do. But now I'll hand over to Derek, who will show you, together with me, what ordinary people are capable of. Hitler was not extraordinary, ordinary. Over to Derek, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Noemie. You've heard an account from people who were oppressed, and now it's my turn to talk about the oppressors. I'm not going to start in Nazi Germany, though. Glasgow, Scotland. That's me at the front, the wee boy in the chair. My pals wore kilts on special days. This is what I wore. Lederhosen. It's indestructible pants. You could slide round the garden and these would last forever. Vorsprung durch Technik. Fantastic. The guy at the back is my dad. His sister married a Scottish soldier after the war. What did I know about Germany? I knew about the bloody lederhosen. I knew that German chocolate was fantastic. I asked the question that every boy asked their dad. What did your father do during the war? Oh, nothing, he said, nothing. He was just a pen pusher. He was an accountant, just a desk clerk. Okay. I'm now going to show you the dullest photograph you've ever seen in a presentation. In fact, you can hardly see it. When you ask who in the company knows more than anyone else in the company, the answer is not the chief executive, or if you were a prime minister, not the prime minister. It's the accountant, because for every item of profit and every item of loss, the accountant has to explain it away. He or she has to come up with a reasoning and a figure. Here we have a particular item, a single item from a set of accounts. The accountant is explaining how the company managed to make a significant loss on a particular item. He explains that it was because of the loss of 8,000 workers on the 4th of November 1942. He explains the loss using a word, Sonderaktion, special action. It was a Nazi euphemism for a massacre, and we are looking at a set of SS accounts from 1942, in which the accountant knew the number of people who were killed and the date and the location. Facts that were not known to the general population. That accountant was my grandfather. So who was he? I'm going to take you through his life story and show you some of 550 photographs that I knew nothing about until I reached the age of 50. And his life began in such a mundane, ordinary way. Yes, he fought in the First World War, but millions of others did. After the war, he married his childhood sweetheart. And here you can see the tender looks of a loving couple who in other circumstances would have lived a blameless life. They raised their first 2 children, my aunt, who ended up in Scotland, and her little brother Dieter. Christmas 1928, Dortmund, a picture of happiness and contentment. A father taking photographs of his children, as any father would do. And when the army came to Dortmund, he took a photograph, as an old soldier would. And then, in September 1930, he joined the Nazi Party. Dortmund was a communist stronghold. Even when Hitler came to power, only 20% of the vote went to the Nazis. And yet my grandfather signed up and is taking photographs like this one he took of a stormtrooper parade through the city. My grandmother is pregnant with my father here. Hitler came to power that year, and my grandfather now has himself a uniform. He's working as an accountant, but he also has a voluntary role in the Nazi Party. He knocks on people's doors at night, asks them for their political views, and if they don't accord with Adolf Hitler's, then he's supposed to report them to the Gestapo. A year later, we now have 3 children, my dad wearing a very nice little hat, and 2 happy children on either side of him. It looks an innocent picture, but the little boy has a belt that shows he's in the junior section of the Hitler Youth. My Aunt Anna is wearing a coat that identifies her as the German girls' version of the Hitler Youth. These children went to school every day, saluted Adolf Hitler, and were told that Jews, black people, gays, Sinti, Roma, anybody who didn't conform to the norm was subhuman. Some education. The man behind the camera is now in a position of some difficulty. For whatever reason, he's lost his job. He can't pay the rent. A friend says, I know somebody who might be able to get you a job. He linked up my grandfather with Heinrich Himmler's deputy in the SS. And so, my grandfather went to the south, to Bavaria, to be, you could say, indoctrinated, except that he was in his 40s. He knew what he was doing. He was joining a fraternity. I worked out that at least 10 of the men that he worked with, that he drank with, went on to become concentration camp commandants. He took photographs like this one of his friends. And this one, the most historically important out of the 550. This may be the arrival of the commandant. It's hard to see, but in that little clump of SS officers, the man on the left, the far left, is giving a Hitler salute. My grandfather, it may be taking this illegally, it's slightly blurred. He's standing in a tower. It's a guard tower, and he is in Dachau concentration camp. By the end of 1938, he'd moved up in the world. He'd moved to the capital, Berlin. A chauffeur took him to work. His family were housed in a beautiful estate on the edge of Berlin, next to the forest of Grunewald. What a charmed life they had. Those were the children. Now here are the grown-ups. New Year's Eve, 1938. This is, 7 weeks after Kristallnacht, when the synagogues were burned, when people were beaten and murdered. And here is a bunch of Nazis on an estate built for the SS on Himmler's orders, having a New Year's party, all totally drunk. In all these family photographs, there's a dissonance. We see photographs of a loving family, clearly comfortable with each other. My aunt there on the right with a kind of wardrobe malfunction. My dad at the front hitching up his lederhosen so hard, it's amazing he managed to have 2 sons. And yet, while this photograph was being taken, Noemie's father was being arrested. While this photograph was being taken, the bombs came down on Berlin, in the capital, in the center, and thousands of people were killed or made homeless. And yet not a single bomb landed on this estate, not a single person even injured. When I found out who my grandfather really was, I asked my dad. He was slipping in and out of dementia at that point. He told me he was a distant man. His father was a distant man. He would go away on business trips, and then he would come back ready to go on another business trip. And when he was at home, he pottered around in the garden, lost in his own thoughts. I've got bad news for all the men in the room. If you'd been in Berlin in 1943, you'd have been taken out of school at the age of 17, and that was the end of your education. You'd be expected to fight for the fatherland, just as Uncle Dieter did. We might think that's pretty tough, but at pretty much the time that he was being signed up for the army, Noemie's grandparents, uncle, and aunt were being gassed in Auschwitz. Dieter manned the guns, firing at the bombers going overhead. And when his best friend's head was blown off next to him, he decided he was going off to fight. He joined the Panzers, the tank regiment. Chance of survival, a little bit less than 5%. This photograph captures Christmas 1944, the last photograph of him before he went off to die at 18. At the end of March, my grandfather came home from work and announced, "We are being relocated and the office will be moving to the Alps." Several SS families set off together in a mixture of trucks and jeeps. My wife and I followed that same path 70 years later. The family stopped off at Dachau for just a few days on the way. And we were planning to stop off at Dachau as well. I told my dad before we went, and he said something that he would never have said had he not been demented. I'm sorry, this is a difficult passage. He told me he could remember the family were housed in a barracks hut with bunk beds. My dad sitting in his bunk bed, his parents standing at the window. He remembered a long, low building with a tall chimney. His parents were looking at it. His mother said, "You know what they're doing there?" His father said, "No." She said, well, they're killing them. They're killing the Jews and burning their bodies." His father said, "No, they wouldn't do that." She said, "Of course they would. Can't you smell the flesh?" By then, I knew exactly who my grandfather was. I knew that his business trips were to Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald. And his workers were people driven into slave labor. I said to the historians at Dachau, is it possible that he went to these places and didn't realize what was going on? Could he see skeletal figures? Could he see beatings? Could he see dead bodies and not comprehend the scale of what was happening? And they said it is impossible. I stepped out of the archive. My wife took this photograph, and I have no memory of her taking it. That's the difficult bit done. Now, we travel, as the family did, up to the Alps, their final destination. We walked up this path just as they did. They got to a cabin at the top, and there they sat out the rest of the war. The day the war ended, my dad watched an American Jeep coming up this track with 4 heavily armed soldiers. They jumped out, they grabbed his sister, stuck a gun in her back, and said, "Take us to your Nazis." And then my father watched as his own father was beaten up a bit and taken away. And he didn't see him again for 3 years. What could the rest of the family do? The war was now over. They went to the nearby town, and there is a photograph of my dad wearing an American soldier's helmet, and his little brother Eki on the right, wearing a little paper hat that an American soldier had made for him. The family eventually, they didn't go back to Berlin. They went to my grandfather's in-laws' little flat in Hameln, And there they died. And maybe it's appropriate that they were buried opposite the Jewish cemetery. As I was researching this story and writing my book, I was buoyed up by two individuals. One was a man called Bernhard, a German, a history teacher, who told me that his own father had committed atrocities in Poland. Bernhard said he could accept what his father had done, but what he could not accept was that his father said, "And I would do it again." When Bernhard retired, he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to teaching the children of Hameln and the surrounding villages about the Jewish communities who had lived there before Hitler. And he even got their parents to restore the gravestones that had been smashed by the Nazis. My other inspiration was the little boy in the paper hat, my Uncle Ecki, who's still alive, still living in Germany. When I wrote a draft of the book, I showed it to him, and his wife helped him translate it. After he'd read it, he said to me, "I find this very hard, but it is true, and you must tell this story." And that was what I did. And so we end up with two families with different approaches to the Holocaust. The wee family in Glasgow who want to hide it, pretend it didn't happen, learn nothing from the past. And Noemie's parents who carried the story forward. And Noemie carries it forward today. And I'm proud to talk with her. Thank you, everyone. Does anyone have any questions? I should say we talked at Oxford and they asked lots and lots.
No pressure.
I was just going to ask if you could maybe read a passage from
Okay. It really refers to, in the talk, about saying that this happened, and people knew about it because a lot of it happened very close to cities and in built-up areas. My mum's prison, when I went to see it, and it exists exactly how it did then, was in the middle of residential flats, in the middle of a residential area. And this excerpt is when my dad is on one of his death marches, and it's his words. And it's in his introduction. "After so many years, can one now relate events, thoughts and feelings as one saw, thought and felt them? Probably not. How does a person feel when he sees his companion being shot the moment he stops walking and realizes he can barely walk himself? Of course, at first he carries on. He wants to live. He reaches for his companion's hand to support him. But the companion is at the end of his strength, and he pushes the hand away. He can't support him. The weak one is left behind. But that one must have seen for oneself the lifeless face, the flickering eyes of a person about to confront his fate. The bullet strikes his neighbor, and soon he will also be struck. Who can say what such a person experiences whilst walking the final steps of his life? Who can describe what he feels and suffers in these moments? And what did I myself experience on this day? As so-called chosen inmates, I had to walk next to the guard and the SS man at the back, and I had to carry the bread sack for the guard. The SS man shot all those who stopped, and the guard had to record their concentration camp numbers. I looked into the barrel of the gun before the bullet struck the neck of the tottering person, looked at the thin stream of blood that ran slowly as life departed the body. I observed the SS man and saw how he ate his carefully prepared sandwich with appetite. In the nearby fields, there were farmers sowing, and at one of the houses by the roadside, a woman was watering flowers. In this moment, a bullet pierced the head of a straggler. A small stream of blood ran down the temple. And all that happened in the midst of built-up fields and lovingly tended flower gardens. Are we still living in this world, or was this all a nasty, unending nightmare? How was it possible that people within 50 meters were quietly going to work, whilst in their midst, exhausted, defenseless people were being shot? Thank you. Do ask us, though. Don't be anything you want at all.
Obviously, with such horrendous stories as these.
Can you take your mask
Sorry,
off? Sorry,
yeah.
it's probably
So
my
obviously,
hearing.
with such horrendous stories as these, it's sometimes quite hard to sort of explain to people, especially children. And I feel like sometimes when we're reporting history, we can very much get lost in figures, the amount of people who died, down to who went to various camps. What do you think is the right way of recounting such stories to children and getting it across in an effective and moving way?
So I've been to primary schools, actually, and I didn't think that I could, and it was actually, I call him a young psychologist, young to me, he's in his 40s, old to you, and he encouraged me to go into primary schools. And the Holocaust was the end, the termination, what they wanted to do to people born to Jewish faith. They wanted to terminate. It was the end effect of. And so what I do when I go to primary schools, I peel it right back to the basic essence of human kindness and your own inner conscience. And we speak about that. And some primary schools teach the children an awful lot already themselves about the Holocaust. And one in particular, close to home, Heaton Park Primary School I went to, was absolutely wonderful. And one little girl, I'll just never forget, she said, "So, Miss, what did the Jews do that Hitler did it to them?" And I think that can feed into today's hatred, or when we're not educated and we don't know, surely people that were so-called punished, she felt, must have done something to deserve this. And so I find with children, actually, they're just as clever as adults, but they're not as nuanced. It's all very black and white. And I think as long as you do it sort of, the latest is probably this term, the spring term, and year 6, then they can talk about it almost throughout the year. They've got the same class teacher, and if they have a thought, they can bring it up again. And obviously, I don't talk about concentration camps. I sort of tell, not saying my mum's story is lesser, but make it acceptable pedagogically to them. But it's basically basic human decency. Thank you. And there was another question, yeah.
You said your mom was more hesitant to talk to you. When did she start talking to you, and why do you think she was more hesitant than your dad?
Yeah, I think in the end it's human nature. My mum didn't really talk to me. I forced it out of her, and it was because somebody else said to me, "Your mum must have a story." I never really understood that my mum had a story. I knew that her relatives were also gassed and burnt in Auschwitz, uncles, aunts, her mum's siblings, but I never understood that my mum was in the war. So it was actually for the Jewish people memorialize the Holocaust in April at the time of the Warsaw Uprising, to commemorate that. And so it was for that event that I presented my mum's story. And as much as my dad spoke twice yearly, once in Dachau and once outside the Munich town hall, my mum buried it. I just think different people deal with it different. I also listened to the testimony of my surviving aunt of Auschwitz, and I listened 3 times, and I asked my cousin, I think there's something missing from this testimony. She never mentioned her time in Auschwitz. It was as if it didn't exist. So it's how we all, like nowadays, how we all deal with our own personal traumas and lives. But thank you. There's a young man in front of you, did you? Yeah.
Thank you. I was just going to wonder, how do you think your respective relatives, your grandfather and your parents, would think about you two doing what you're doing now together?
Did you?
Shall I start? I think my grandfather would have hated it, absolutely loathed it. We spoke in a synagogue at one of the Jewish holy days, and the rabbi said, "Here you are, Derek, you're holding the hand of a Holocaust survivor in a synagogue on one of our holy days wearing a kippah. What would your grandfather say?" And off the top of my head, I said, "I don't care. We're beyond him. I would never find out from him why he did it. The SS, they all closed themselves off from facing what they'd done."
I asked my mum permission, and I felt I wanted to tell my mum. It was my idea. Derek always says I stalked him on Facebook. I found Derek on Facebook, and so I asked my mum, but it was a journey for myself too.
I can just talk loudly because I can project. When finding out about your grandfather, obviously you had a lot of emotions. Did it change how you felt about your father when you found out about your grandfather, especially since you found out later? So how did your relationship or your view of your father change?
It never changed my relationship with my father. He had had mental health issues all his life. He tried to kill himself 3 times. I felt sad for him in a way, because he had such a blighted life for all sorts of reasons. And he was slipping into dementia, and no, I never felt any anger or sad disappointment about him not saying anything. I could understand he was a German who'd come to Scotland after the war, like Noemie being a Jew in a class where she was the only one. You stay down. You don't draw attention to yourself. And I think he just did that as a way of life. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. I just had a question. I apologize if it's a difficult one, but obviously, most people here are here to listen to your respective stories, but there are people in the world who just don't want to. Where do you think it comes from when people try to deny that the Holocaust happened, and how do you respond to it, from your own perspectives?
Do you want to start?
I've not had it directly, but if I would, I think it would almost, to me, Holocaust denial is an extreme form of hatred. And it's very difficult to engage, because I feel that they're quite extreme in their view. So it makes me more determined to speak to people who are not extreme, might be quite a bit to the right, to the left, wherever, what I call the 80% majority of people are in the middle, and that's why it makes me just more determined to speak, particularly to young people like yourselves, and just engage in a conversation and speak openly about being scared of different or finding it difficult and what we can do, and it's much more enriching. Derek?
Yeah, I mean, the most exciting talks we give, no disrespect to you folks, but when we speak in a school where there's a huge ethnic diversity, the atmosphere is electric, because every single kid in that school gets it. They understand what prejudice, what hatred is. And to have grown-ups going into the school and saying, be kind to each other, be kind to people who are different to you. We spoke at a school in Derby on Monday. When we'd finished speaking, the kids asked us questions for an hour and a quarter afterwards. Question after question after question. Because they get it, and they sense some kind of positivity there. And yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to something you said about when you were researching your book. You spoke to someone who said that his grandfather said he would do it all again. And I wondered if he or yourself ever came to understand that perspective, or if indeed it is possible to understand.
Yes. There was a famous German who said if the Holocaust perpetrators came to terms with what they'd done, they would all hang themselves. And if you look at the most serious perpetrators who were caught and kept in Landsberg prison after the war, awaiting trial at Nuremberg, not one of them, actually one out of 250, regret. The others all either turned to religion as a defense, or they justified themselves in some way. They could not bring themselves to admit that they were wrong. In fact, there was a program this week on the BBC called Final Account. There was one German in that program who expressed regret. One. Everybody else had reasons why they didn't do anything, or why they did what they did. So it's a denial. It's a denial of responsibility. Yeah, thank you. Yes, and again.
So there's been a sharp rise in anti-Semitism globally over the last few years. Has this shown up in the talks that you've been doing or in your experiences?
We did have it this week. We did, unfortunately. We had two girls who talked throughout Noemie speaking and stared at her. And it was interesting because I'd been talking to the kids about if you're Hindu, then try to get to know Muslims and make friends with them. If you're Muslim, make friends with Hindus. And when this clear anti-Semitism was taking place, I didn't think they're being anti-Semitic. I thought, how dare they behave like this in front of my friend, to my friend Noemie? And that was a revelation to me, because I wasn't seeing Noemie as a representative of a Jewish faith. I was seeing Noemie as my friend. And this is what we're trying to say to children. Don't identify people by their label. Identify them as human beings and respond to them as human beings and treat them as human beings.
The interesting thing is that we don't identify ourselves by our label. I never thought of myself first and foremost Jewish. Probably how you all feel about yourselves. You think of yourself maybe first as female or male, or your name or your family role, but it's by the bys. But there is a rise globally of hatred, and I think it's so much more important in a way that we educate. I feel that's the only thing we can do, is sort of have these talks and sit here and see that people born to the Jewish faith belong to the human race. Once by mistake I blurted out, and everyone belongs to the Jewish race, like this. And anyway, it was a marvelous icebreaker. I was so nervous, it all jumbled out. But we all belong to one race, the human race. So, but it does need educating, because I myself put myself in the bag. I have prejudices. We just all are like that. And it's wonderful to have achieved the status of friend, that one gets seen as the friend and the person you are, rather than the labels.
You both obviously now know a great deal about the Holocaust and what took place and the atrocities. So I was just wondering how you both maintain some optimism in human nature with everything we know.
We get that from you guys. I do.
Yeah, definitely. We went 2 years ago now. We went to school in Hackney, and the head teacher told us proudly that his school was the 5th most disadvantaged school in England. They were a fantastic audience. They were so positive. They were so positive about wanting to do good in the world. And you think those kids have nothing. Those kids have absolutely nothing. And yet They are positive. So if they're positive, hell, we've got to be as well. Definitely.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just talk about your friendship and how you met and how you got to know each other and what's brought you together today.
I think it's important to start with the barriers that we created. And I'll confess, first of all, that at one talk I introduced us as the grandson of an SS officer and an Orthodox Jew. And we have built enough trust now that Noemie could come to me afterwards and say, I don't like you introducing me as an Orthodox Jew. And she was absolutely right, because I was introducing her by her religion rather than a human being who happens to be Jewish. Noemie, it's your confession now.
Yeah. I felt othered, basically. And poor Derek went into this unbeknownst. He was being kind, and it came from a kind place, but I immediately felt othered. I felt everybody in the audience knew that I am born to Jewish faith, and in the talk I'm trying to show that even though I'm born to this faith by accident of birth, as is Derek, that I'm human. And I surprised myself and almost shocked myself because, as I told you, I called this partnership. I asked for it and sought it out. And I went to hear Derek speak at Pinner Synagogue, and I liked everything he said and felt I liked Derek. And I went up to Derek, like you heard, and I said, oh, let's do this together. So the next meeting was at King's Cross, together with Derek's wife, Sarah, who's also become a dear friend. And Sarah already tried to be practical. She's a wonderful shining light onto our talks and has helped me to form my talks and give me the courage to speak without paper. And she had her laptop with her, and on the screen was Derek's grandfather next to my father. And I had a reaction, but I just felt really, really uncomfortable, almost unwell. And I didn't like that I felt like that, because I was asking for this union, and why did I feel like that? And also, what could I say to Derek and Sarah? I barely knew them. This was the second meeting, just at the end. The first time was the end of a talk. Hello, let's do this, goodbye. It felt rude. But Sarah's very sensitive and intuitive and highly intelligent, and she realized I was uncomfortable, and she allowed me to express it. I felt uncomfortable because even though I had asked my mum permission, I hadn't asked my dad. This was a very new relationship. Derek hadn't hurt anybody in my family. Derek's ancestors, Derek's granddad, who he didn't even know, had hurt, and I didn't realize how deeply the hurt and the pain had penetrated, I presume. So what I'm asking of you is I'm asking of myself as well, as a mature lady, to step out there, and we call it building bridges, but it is that. You know, and I always say to people, you don't have to, you're allowed to dislike, and if you hate, hate. But do you have to kill on hate? Do you really have to hurt? But thank you for that question, yeah. Yeah, there's two more, yeah.
My question is more towards Derek, and it's possibly a bit of a personal question, I don't know what to that. And it's how did you and do you think the younger generations should deal with teachers, so collective guilt, especially kind of in the face of uncertain history, because those generations are very much kind of stuck under the conflict, like apart from having these conversations and learning about that history, like on a personal level, how do we deal with that?
It's very, very, very difficult for young Germans, because guilt is a horrible emotion that can turn into resentment. A nation without pride in its past, people who are taught to be guilty about what their people did, is not a good recipe for the future, really. I'd like them to step away from a nation of guilt and see themselves as a nation who, perhaps more than any other country that I know, addresses its past and says, this is what a country did. But we are not of that generation, and we can do better. I think that's important. I think it's important. It's important to get rid of the guilt, because it's not helpful at all.
So I'm actually German, and I was raised there, and I went to school there, and I just came to the UK. And I was just wondering what you both think of the way that the German school system, how it deals with Nazi Germany and how it could be improved. Because I can see a lot of the issues that she raised are still very much present.
To say the last thing, and you see a lot of issues being...
Then it's quite difficult to deal with it, especially from a young age on, to kind of find the balance between showing what happened and how many of our ancestors were very much involved in it, and then, but obviously at the same time, not trying to let everyone, like the whole generation, as you said, have Kollektivschuld.
In a sense, I'd like Britain to grow up as Germany has, in that Germany addresses its past from a distance, just as Britain should address its past in slavery from a distance. And we shouldn't have politicians defending people who committed crimes in the past. I think it's important to create that gap and that rational thinking. From the outside, we see Germany as being very, very open about its past. You go to Berlin, and the information about the Holocaust is quite explicit. But I'm interested in how you feel about reading these kind of things, knowing that I imagine your great-great-grandparents were involved, or your great-grandparents' generation were involved. Does that make you feel you want to hide it, or you don't want to know, or... there are all sorts of interesting points here.
So I don't know a lot of it from my grandma's side, or from my mum, from my father's side. My grandma was, which obviously put in a bad position. So from like that position, I got to know as much as possible, and I think to you. There's so much time. There's a lot of very, so my school was like a full break for people who saw escape, so they had the stuff like from the roofs and stuff. I think for that one, I want to know as much as possible, and I think it's really important that everyone else in Germany does, because especially with what we see happening very recently in Germany, on the political spectrum, as much as we have there's so much more that needs to be done, because there's still a lot of right-wing stuff going on. It's quite surprising. So I and my friends and a lot of people, I think, want to know, but obviously there's still right-wing.
Fantastic. Thank you.
May I add on to that? Because I'm also German, and so I have the experience that you get taught about the Holocaust in every single subject, even music. Every year you talk about the Holocaust, which is super important, and I do find that very good. What I experienced in my class is that I started getting it so much that young students started taking it into a joke. That they started doing the Hitler post as a joke and wouldn't take it seriously anymore. And I think it is an issue. I went to a normal state school, and I love that we are confronted with it so much and have to think about it, but that does really ingrain the Kollektivschuld, or collective guilt that we were talking about. And it is difficult because a lot of us, from my family, from what I can gather, my grandma, she was a refugee. My grandfather was sent to the war as a 17-year-old. He barely witnessed the end, but he spent some time actually as a British prisoner for a while. On the other side, it gets a lot murkier. I don't know. I know I am related to some people who were quite atrocious. But it's a very, very strong murky water. And funnily enough, some of the stories come out through dementia, where I don't know what's real, what's not. My grandfather, who went on his way to kind of his senior home, broke down crying, telling my father that he can hear the Jews next door being taken away, and we don't know if he actually experienced that. But it's something we grow up with. At least in my family, it was very, very present. So it's like that deep ingrained guilt, especially if you don't know what your own history is. And it's very difficult, kind of also coming to the UK. That's the very first thing that you're confronted with. People ask me where I'm from. I say I'm from Berlin. I'm not from Germany, because if I say I'm from Germany, chances are I'm going to get a Holocaust joke as a response. If I say I'm from Berlin, they might think that's like techno or the wall, but they won't immediately assume that my ancestors might be a Nazi, or I'm a Nazi and a constant, like in the UK, we won the war, as if they had a part of it and I was on the other side. I think it's a very difficult history. Yeah. But not in Cambridge, but in the UK now.
Yeah.
Really surprised me to hear that. When we moved, my brother was 8, and he went to a Jewish school, and he had a very strong German accent, and he got called Hitler. So happened, and he's Jewish, obviously. I think, in life, it's always in balance. If you get something too much taught, it counteracts it. And I think often with the Holocaust, it's good if you peel it right back to what I said before, even though it sounds simple and banal, but to be what in German or in Yiddish you call being a Mensch, just being a decent, good person. And it's funny that we need to be taught it, but we do. And a German student came up to me in Oxford. I must, first of all, really applaud you both for sharing this with us. I really feel that we've achieved something in this talk if you can come and tell us that. So I think that's wonderful from my perspective, and I thank you both. I think you're brave, and that's what we want to do, is to really open and crack the shells. But this young German student said that in Germany they get taught a lot of histories and not many personal stories. And I feel, in particularly with the Holocaust, you have to have the human aspect, because I always say that's what the Nazis took away from themselves, to treat people of Jewish faith or LGBT or others like that. And they also took it away to the people that they did it to both themselves. I always say it's the largest tragedy that befell mankind on both sides, really. Because it's not nice. Normally, our dads or granddads were proud of them. It must be unnerving not to have that, and to have that on a large scale. It's difficult. But I think what we can see from this talk is what it caused immediately, and the ripple effects on both sides to this day. And that things can happen again like that, again, if we allow it to. And that each of us has actually got a strength, even though we might not think we have. Each of us has got a part to play. Because it was Hitler on his own couldn't have done it. But thank you, really.
I guess this is kind of like loosely related and like following on, because I'm kind of I'm Palestinian and Lebanese and Syrian, and obviously like in that culture, it's kind of hard to like demarcate the boundaries between carrying anger at like treatment from like Israel, and like differentiating that between like anti-Semitism, and like there is very much like a culture of like a disparaging way in which like you refer to like Yehudis, and there is like a lot of family and like generational prejudice there. So I guess what I wanted to ask in, like, I suppose it's somewhat easier for you two to form this partnership now because this was kind of your ancestors and longer ago, but kind of like for people like me, and like my generation, who like this is happening now, for example, with Israel and Palestine, and there are people that like read like they don't want to talk to them, they don't want to, you know, like confront that because there's just too much like loss and suffering and violence behind that to like even be able to confront it. So I guess my question is, yeah, about like, you know, how do you build partnerships like when it is happening, and how do you, you know, when one side slogan is like death to all Arabs, for example, like how do you seek out a partnership, and how, on the other hand, how do you prevent like ordinary people from becoming like, you know, radicalized by extremely prejudiced opinions? You know, how do you like prevent calls for justice against a regime like spilling over into anti-Semitism? I guess especially, you know, like in the crux of the conflict, you know, like for me, obviously like we have memories in Lebanon of like the Israeli invasion in 1983, and then in 2006 when again like we had to leave. So like with all that memory kind of still being very fresh and current, how do you kind of navigate that?
I think it's a very good question, but I just want to say that Palestine and Israel is not Nazi Germany. I can't accept that, but you asked beautifully and kindly and also bravely, really courageous, because it's really how to make peace with people. I've been to Israel personally. I've never been to the so-called Palestinian areas because I don't feel safe there. Told I'm not safe. But I see many Palestinian people or Arab people in Israel. And today there is the Arabs in parliament, part of the coalition. Certainly my mum got treated by Arab doctors in the Israeli hospitals. She made a very good friend with an Arab lady, they shared beds, and vice versa. And people, like you say, what you asked and plead for is to have a normal life, because I feel that most normal human beings don't want to be at war. But I think it's very difficult to talk to extremists or people with extreme views. We're too late. And Derek always says very often in his talks, act while it's safe to do so. And I think it's to talk to people who are like-minded. In Israel, there are people equally who want peace, and I know that there's certain groups that they start the schools, but it's almost, it's going back to schools and back to basics and starting in the schools, saying that they're people like any other, and not to bring up people with hate, because otherwise we keep perpetuating. If we instill in the breast milk the hate, excuse the metaphor, then there is no hope. But with a question like you, there is hope, I feel, because you're still seeking peace after everything you've been through, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, no, I didn't, I was obviously a bit intimidated because I know it's quite, like, can be quite a dicey question and everything, and like, you know, cause tension. But I just, yeah, I find like your partnership and like your endeavors to educate people, especially like on a school level, because like at a like children's ages, like when a lot of that indoctrination happens and like when you're exposed to that culture, like especially like, you know, like being in Lebanon and like growing up around those friends. So I just kind of, yeah, wanted to know like your opinions on how you kind of overcame it.
So much. Oh, whoa. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and talking about this. It's very hard to hear, and it's very difficult stories, but they weren't so long ago, so they're so important to discuss as well. But I wanted to ask something that really resonated with me that you said was that Hitler was not extraordinary, he was ordinary. And I wanted to ask what has changed? Like, obviously the war ended and belief systems changed, or something changed, because whilst there are still Nazis and there are still people who will deny the Holocaust, I do think that a lot of people around me see the Holocaust as the tragedy it is and how terrible it was that happened. But whilst that was going on, there were ordinary families like yours that some of which contributed to this, and kind of what has changed and how can we avoid that from happening again? Because I guess it was just it wasn't so long ago, and I'm just curious, like, how belief systems have changed so much in so little time. Thank you.
Will you forgive me? I've got to go and catch my train back to Manchester. I feel awful because the discussion is really getting good and open and frank, and I just thank you, and I'd gladly come back another time to carry on, or you get my email from Lara if you've got any questions. But a huge, huge thank you. I'll take you all away with me because your questions meant so much. Thank you very, very much.
It's just me now, folks. I don't know where to start answering. I think one of the things that we stress more and more now is the relevance of the Holocaust to other genocides. And we went earlier this week to a place where there were people from Bosnia, big Bosnian population, big Ukrainian population, countries that have had their own genocides, and they were sharing in a Holocaust memorial because there were so many similarities. Groups that were demonized and dehumanized and then murdered. Germany itself took a very long time. You know, people from Germany who are here know that Germany itself, for many years, tried to pretend that the Holocaust hadn't happened, and there was an expression, Schwamm darüber, meaning just wipe it away. And it was the second generation, the grandchildren mostly, who came forward to say, we're not happy with this, we want to know what our country did. So you are the, fourth generation, fifth generation? Keep the lessons of the Holocaust, bring in the lessons from other genocides, and resist the tendency towards authoritarianism, which is presenting a simplistic version of humanity, and one that is driven by envy, contempt, hatred, all the bad elements of human behavior, and try to encourage the kindness, understanding, tolerance. Does that answer some of your question? Yes.
I wish I'd asked this a little earlier because I'd love to hear from both of you. In the United States this week, Whoopi Goldberg, who's a famous black woman celebrity, for those who don't know who she is, she got in trouble for saying that the Holocaust was not about race. It was about man's inhumanity to man. And the reason this caused a lot of issues is that obviously white supremacy was so essential to the Holocaust and to the Germans. And Noemie tonight talked a lot about the Jewish faith, but at the time it was also the Jewish race. And so how do you address and deal with the, kind of the tension between the key role that white supremacy and race played, both at the time as well as how we deal with it?
Very, very good point, and a very pertinent one, because Noemie spent about an hour this afternoon discussing the Whoopi Goldberg situation. And it was an interesting discussion because I have a friend who is of Ashkenazi Jew descent. There are Jews living in Morocco, there are Jews from Russia, from Poland, from countries all over the world. So at what point did you decide that Jews are a race? Because my feeling there is that if you make people a race, then you say they're not like us, they're not like me. Or that's a potential way to attack somebody. So it is quite problematic. The white supremacists rely on attacking people who are not like them. If they can decide that somebody's of a different race, then they're fair game. But I think it's interesting to look at Because we are, as Noemie keeps saying, we are all part of the human race. And maybe the emphasis should be on us as humans. And it's a bit idealistic, I know. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you.